Chapter 9. The ice broke up and the spring came. The dull red rocks down by the fjord were baked in the sunshine, and the spray gleamed white under the bull crag, as though new-born. The soil turned green and breathed its sweet smell of grass and mould, and then came the time of bursting buds, filling the evening air with a cool and bitter scent of young leaves along the valley. One morning in May, Olav came across a nest of vipers on a slope. He killed 3 of them. He brought them home in a closed wooden cup, and during the midday rest he stole to the cookhouse with them. Snake's fat and snake's ashes are good for many things, but they have much more power if one goes secretly about the preparation of them. He was about to slip into the cookhouse when he heard voices. Ingunn was there, and the boy. The child's voice said, "Because father gave me the breast, you see." "He gave you the breast?" his mother wondered. "What nonsense are you talking now?" "Oh, yes, he did. And then father said I might eat up the wings too, if I had not had enough. But there was nothing left of the cock but the wings." Olav laughed quietly to himself. Now he remembered. In the inn at Oslo the woman had set before him a roast cock, and the boy had liked the meat hugely. Then he heard Ingunn say, "A whole cock I will roast for you, Eirik. Will that make you think I am as kind as your father? You shall have it next time he goes away from home." Olav stole back across the yard and went east to the smithy. He felt a strange sense of shame on her behalf. What was the use of such talk? Surely she could roast one of her own cocks for the child, whether he were at home or not. Whether it was that the unaccustomed food was too rich for Eirik's stomach, or from some other cause, as spring went on the child took to waking up and screaming nearly every night. Olav heard Eirik start up with a shriek, crawl around, and grope this way and that in the big north bed, where he slept alone. Then he shrieked again, even louder, as though in utmost terror. Ingunn tumbled out of bed and went to him. "Eirik! Eirik! Eirik mine! Hush! 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 You will wake your father. Oh, be quiet now. There is nothing here that you need be afraid of, my little son." "You had better bring him over to us," came Olav's voice, wide awake from the darkness. "Oh, has he waked you again?" complained Ingunn, as she came back with the boy and lay down. The two tossed and wriggled till they were comfortable. "I was not yet asleep." "What have you dreamt of this time, Eirik?" But at night it was only his mother who could serve Eirik's turn. He simply nestled closer to her and did not answer his father. They never got to hear anything of his dreams. He made a gesture of wiping something from his hands and throwing it from him 2 or 3 times. Then he gave a sigh of relief and lay down to rest. Very soon they were both asleep. Olav was always more sleepless in spring than at other seasons. He seldom fell asleep before midnight and woke very early. On these early summer mornings the fjord often lay smooth as a mirror, pale blue and glistening in the sunlight, and the desolate shore opposite seemed bright and tranquil as a mirage. Olav was absurdly happy and light-hearted when he went out on such a morning. Torhild Bjornsdatter was singing somewhere in the outhouses. She had already been long at work. Olav and the girl met in the yard. They stood and talked together in the morning sunshine. When he came in again some hours later, he sometimes stood for a moment looking at the two, mother and child, who was still asleep. Eirik lay with his face against his mother's neck, breathing with half-open mouth. Ingunn held her narrow hand, heavy with rings, about his shoulder. A fortnight before St. John's Day, Ingunn gave birth to a man-child. Olaf had him christened at once, Audun. It was a tiny boy, purple and skinny. Olaf put 2 fingers around his son's hand one day, when he lay in Sigrid Undset's lap and was being washed. It was so thin, that little hand, almost like a chicken's leg, and just as cold. Olaf felt no very deep affection for his son, or joy that at last he had one. The waiting had been so long that the bare suspicion that Ingunn might be with child again had struck him with black despondency. He had grown so unused to the hope that all this misery might end at last in rejoicing that he had to have time to take it in. But he saw that it was not so with the mother. In spite of her having expected nothing but bitter pain, against her own will, her heart had trembled each time with hopeless and despairing love for the little unborn creatures. Now Audun inherited this love from all his brothers, who had left behind them not even a name or a memory. Eirik was boisterously happy at having a brother. He knew from Siljuas that the birth of a child was the greatest of great events. Then there were 2 or 3 strange women in the house, and they brought with them good food, and candles were burning in the room all night long. The child in the cradle was tended as a most precious thing. Those outside the fence were lying in wait to steal it, and its health and well-being were constantly inquired after. That it was the worst off of all in the home, when the next child came and took its place in the cradle, the child of yesteryear was abandoned to the care of its little sisters, always in the way and always in danger. Of this Eirik took no account. Here in this house the time was of immense festivity, so many wives, each with her own maid, and masses of food. But the candles at night he and his father were cheated of. His mother and the new brother lay in another house. "It's my silken brother, but it's only your woolen brother," he said to Thorhild's 2 youngest children, as they stood together watching Audun being dressed. Olaf was sitting with his wife at the moment. He heard it and glanced at Ingunn. She lay looking at her 2 sons, radiant with joy. His son, that little creature there that the maid was pulling about. The other bent his healthy, beaming face over him, and prattled to the little brother, whom all unwittingly he had deprived of his birthright. It had caused a certain mild stir in the neighbourhood when the people of Hestviken so unexpectedly produced a big son of 5, who had been hidden away all this time. Olaf was not very well liked in the neighbourhood. He had been received with evident and cordial goodwill when he came home to his own, but little by little a feeling grew up among the people of the countryside that he had repelled their offers of friendship and good neighbourship. Olaf kept to himself more than they liked, and in company he was little inclined to be sociable. Never discourteous, and this did not make him more popular, for it was taken as a sign that he thought himself something above the other Franklins, but taciturn, quiet, and unapproachable. It was hinted in private, with a slight sneer, that Olaf must think himself something like a courtier, since he had been Earl Alf's man, and was kinsman on his mother's side to these great Danish lords who lay here in Norway half a year at a time, and fed at the Duke's table. Yes, yes, they knew. He owned his father's manor yet, whole and undivided. But let him wait, and see how long that would last, in days such as these. Although he never shirked doing anything that was his due, and was not ill-natured when it was a question of helping anyone, nobody cared to ask Olav Audunsson to do him a favour. For if folk who were in difficulties went to the rich Master of Hestviken, It was as though he scarce troubled himself to listen to them. When they had explained to him their situation at length, he would ask at the end of it all, as though he had been thinking of other things, "Yes, and what was it they wanted?" No one could deny that Olaf was generous both in giving and lending. But if anyone would ease his heart and discuss his affairs with him, there was no comfort to be had of it in that house. He gave such answers that one knew not whether the man was foolish or independent. So that unless folk had the most crying need of a helping hand, they preferred to go to another, who would listen to what they said, express an opinion, and give counsel and consolation, even if this man might not grant them help without some hanging back, saying he was badly off himself, but in God's name. Another matter which had been remarked by the neighbours was that no man had seen Olaf get honestly drunk or free-spoken in a carouse. He drank no less than other good men at a banquet, but it seemed that God's gifts did not bite on him. And by degrees there grew up a feeling in the countryside, vague and formless, for no one really knew on what they based it, but with all its obscurity it was as strong as a certainty, that this man had something on his mind, a secret misfortune or a sin. The handsome, erect young master, with the broad, fair face beneath his curly flaxen hair, was a marked man. It was a strange thing, too, about his wife, that she could not give birth to living children. Little it was that one saw of Ingunn Steinfinnsdatter, and the poor thing was not much to look at either. But folk still remembered how fair she had been, and that not so many years ago. And now it came out that they had a child. For all these years they had had a son hidden away, the devil knew where, far in the north in her home country. Begotten while the father was an outlaw. Yes, that was it. Olaf had made that known, briefly and clearly. Folk knew that his quarrel with his wife's kinsman had arisen from this, that Steinfinn on his deathbed had given into Olaf's charge the daughter to whom the lad had been betrothed since their childhood. Olaf had accepted her as his wife, and it was impossible to interpret Steinfinn's words otherwise than that this accorded with his wishes. But the new sponsors had thought they might dispose of the fair and wealthy maid in another manner. Now Olaf declared that the summer before he made final reconciliation with his wife's kinsman, he had secretly visited the house where she dwelt. But in the meantime, this had had to be kept secret. So said Olav Audunsson. But folk began to wonder. Perhaps it was not so sure that Olaf had accepted purely of his own free will the wife he was made to marry by Steinfinn's order, while he was a mere boy and subject to Steinfinn's authority. Had he not rather tried to shuffle out of a marriage into which he had been forced in childhood? Folk who had seen a little of their life together, their serving folk and the neighbours' wives who had been with Ingunn when she lay sick, spoke of what they knew. True enough, Olaf was good to his wife in a way, but he was as sulky and silent at home as he was abroad. Days might pass when he spoke not a word to his wife. Ingunn never looked happy, and this was not so strange either. A woman who was tied to this cross-stick of a husband, always in bad health, and giving birth to one dead child after another. One day the new priest, Sigrid Undset, came to Hestviken. He was a fairly young man, tall and slight, with a handsome face, but his hair was fiery red, and folk thought he had a haughty look. He had made himself somewhat disliked in a short time. Scarcely had he come to the parish when he raised dissension on every side, over the property of the church and the incomings of the glebe, over old agreements which Sire Benedict had made with the owners of the land, but which this new man found to be unlawful. Both the monastery on Hovdo and the nuns' convent of Nonneseter owned farms and shares of farms in the parish, as did several of the churches and pious foundations in Oslo. The deputies of these institutions were, for the most part, wise and kindly men, who were on good terms with the country folk, many of whom had bought themselves a resting place within the walls of the convent. And when it happened that any of the Hovado monks themselves came to visit their farms, the Franklins flocked from far around to hear Mass in their chapels. And then it was not long before Sire Halbjorn fell out with the convent folk. On the other hand, the priest had set his whole heart upon some monks of a new order that had just come into the country. They went barefoot, in habits which were like sackcloth and ashes, and the virtues they chiefly practised were said to be humility, meekness, and frugality. It was said these friars begged their daily bread as they went about, teaching rich and poor the true fear of God. And if they had anything left in their bag after Vespers, they were to share it among the poor, and themselves go out each morning with empty hands. Now it was sure that Sire Halbjorn was neither humble nor meek, but proud of his birth. He came of noble stock, far away in Valdres, and he was little fitted to teach the fear of God, for he was so learned and his speech was so hard to understand that folk had no great benefit from listening to him. But he could never praise these beggar friars enough. Minorites they called themselves, and made himself, as it were, their protector, gave great gifts to the house which they had set about building in the town, and tried to persuade his parishioners to do the same. But folk found out that this must be because the Duke favoured these monks greatly, while the bishop and most of the priests and learned men in the town liked them ill, and thought that the rule of this order was dangerous and unsound. And folk knew that Sire Halbjorn had been sent out to this parish because he, a man who by birth and rare learning seemed destined for the highest offices of the church, had fallen out with the bishop and the whole chapter of Oslo, through being so proud and quarrelsome, and thinking he knew and understood and could teach everything better than all the others. But they were not able to do anything worse to him than banish him to this good calling. His conduct was blameless in everything else. He had studied in foreign lands for many years, and he knew all that was to be known of the law and justice of the land, from the oldest times down to his own day. It was in order to hear what Olaf knew about a right to salmon fishing in a little river over on the Hudaheim side that he had come today. Olaf could not tell him much. The farm with which the right went had been sold by his grandfather to his son-in-law, and since then it had been divided and had passed into many hands. He could see that Sire Halbjorn was vexed because he could tell him so little of the matter. Nevertheless, Olaf asked, while the priest sat at meat, if he could throw a little light on a question which weighed upon his mind. "It concerns my sons." It was thus. He had heard that a child begotten while the father is under ban of outlawry is outside the law and has no rights, even if the mother be the outlaw's duly married wife. "No, no," said Sire Halbjorn, with a sweep of his hand. "You have heard of the wolf's cub?" Such was the name they gave to an outlawed man's child in old days. Then it was so that the outlaw was treated as a dead man. His estate was divided, and his wife held to be a widow, and if he were granted grace, he had to ask her again of her kinsfolk, and wed her anew. But you know full well that such a law cannot hold among Christian men. Among us no sin and no sentence can sever the bond of wedlock between man and wife. Her kinsman would not have it that it was lawful wedlock, that which had been made between us when we were young, said Olav. It was only after Eirik was born that I got her with her kinsfolk's consent. You need have no fear on that score now, whether the boy were true-born or not. He enjoys the same rights now that you are married with her kinsfolk's consent, so none can dispute with you whether it is lawful marriage." "Then it is certain," asked Olav, "that Audun can never come forward and oust Eirik from his right as our firstborn?" "Certainly he cannot," said the priest decisively. "Well, thank you. I wish to be sure how this matter stood." Yes, 'tis natural enough," replied Sara Halbjorn. Olaf thanked him for his information. Whilst his mother was lying in, Eirik took to talking of one he called Totrabassa. At first the grown people thought this was a beggar woman, one of those who came in greater numbers now that the house was overflowing with food and drink. "Yes, Totrabassa was a woman with a bag," said Eirik. But another day he said that Totrabassa had been there and had played with him in the field behind the barn. There was a little hollow in the meadow where he was fond of going with his things. Totrabassa was a little maid. No one paid much attention to this. They were all quite used to the queer nonsense Eirik so often talked. But after a while he began to tell of more playfellows, and they all had strange names, like Toragora, Zilvarp, Skolorm, Dolvendog, and Kolmurna the Blue. Whether they were men or women, grown up or children, it was not easy to make out. The housefolk grew alarmed. It still happened sometimes that a whole household left croft or cabin, great and small, and took to the wood, either because they were pursued by the law or from sheer poverty, and chose a vagabond life, in summer at any rate, rather than be brought to justice. Just at this time a fat sheep was lost that had been kept in the home pasture, and now the housecarls thought that these friends of Eirik's must be vagabonds of this sort, who lived chiefly by pilfering and stealing. Folk kept an eye on Eirik when he was playing in the hollow, whether any unknown children or grown people might come to him. But nothing was seen. And one day the sheep's carcass was washed up in the bay. It had fallen from the cliff. And now the people of Hestviken were afraid in earnest. This must be some of the underground folk. They asked Eirik if he knew where they came from. "Oh, from far away, under the crag." But when he saw how frightened the others were at this, he was a little scared himself. "No, they came from the town," he said. "In a sled they came." "Or maybe they sailed," he corrected himself, when Olaf said no one could drive a sled from Oslo in summer-time. He must not talk with such nonsense. "Anyhow, they came from the woods." "Ah, yes, they dwelt in the woods," Toragora had said. Toragora was the one he talked most about. Ingunn was quite beside herself with despair. These must be the evil spirits who had turned all luck from this house, generation after generation. Now they were surely after her children. Eirik was shut up in the women's house and watched, and then he talked and talked of these friends of his till it looked as if his mother would lose her wits with despair. She wanted Olaf to fetch the priest. "Now, you are not lying, Eirik, by chance?" asked Olaf severely one day, when he had been listening while Eirik replied to his mother's anxious questions. Eirik stared in terror at his father with his great brown eyes, and shook his head vehemently. "For if I find out one day, boy, that you bear untruthful tales, it will go ill with you." Eirik looked at his father in wonder, seeming not to understand. But Olaf had conceived a suspicion that the whole story was a thing the boy had invented, unreasonable as such an idea appeared to himself, for he could not make out what object the child could have in spreading such vain and purposeless lies. And the next day, when Olaf and a man were to mow the meadow that lay behind the hollow, he let Eirik come with them, promising Ingunn that they would keep a sharp watch on the child all the time. Olaf did so, looking out for the boy now and again. Eirik pottered about, good and quiet, up in the hollow, playing with some snail shells and pebbles that the boatman had given him. He was quite alone the whole time. When the other man and the girls went up to the morning meal, Olaf came up to Eirik. "So, they did not come to see you today, Totrabrasa and Skolorm and the rest?" "Oh, yes," said Eirik radiantly, and he began telling of all the games he had played with them today. "Now you are lying, boy," said Olaf harshly. "I have watched you the whole time. No one has been here." "They took to their heels when you came. They were afraid of your scythe." "Then what has become of them? Where did they go to?" "Home, to be sure." "Home? And where may that be?" Eirik looked up at his father, puzzled and a little diffident. Then his face brightened eagerly. "Shall we go there, father?" And he held out his hand. Olaf hung his scythe on a tree. "Let us do that." Eirik led him up to the manor, out of the yard and on to the rocks to the west of the houses, where they could see over the fjord. "They must be down there," he said, pointing to the little strip of beach that lay below them. "I don't see anybody," said Olaf shortly. "No, they are not there. Now I know where they are." Eirik first turned back toward the manor, but then he took a path that led down to the waterside. "Now I know," he called eagerly, hopping and skipping as he waited for his father. Then he ran on ahead again, stopped and waited, and took his father by the hand, dragging him down along the path. He showed the way to the farthest of the sheds by the quay. Olaf hardly ever used this one. There was not so much trade at Hestviken now. Only in spring, when Olaf was preparing to visit the Holy Cross Fair at Oslo, did he store some of his winter goods here. Now the shed was empty and unlocked. Eirik drew his father into it. The sea splashed and gurgled about the piles under the floor of the shed. This was leaky and the walls were gaping, so that reflections of the sunlight from the water rose and fell in bright streaks on walls and roof. Eirik sniffed in the salt smell of the shed, and his face sparkled with excitement. He looked up into his father's eyes with a smile of expectation, and, stealing on tiptoe, led him to an old barrel standing bottom upwards, which Olaf used to pack skins in. "Here," he whispered, squatting down. "They live in here. Can you see them? Now the cracks have grown so big again, else we could see them better, but they are sitting there eating. Can you see them?" Olaf turned the barrel on its side and gave it a kick, so that it rolled away. There was nothing underneath but some litter. Eirik looked up, smiling, and was about to say something, when he noticed the expression on his father's face and stopped in terror, open-mouthed. With a scream, he put up his arms to ward off the blow, bursting into a heart-rending fit of weeping. Olaf let his hand drop. He felt it was unworthy of him to strike the boy. So puny and miserable Eirik looked as he stood there in tears, that his father was almost ashamed of himself. He just took the child's arms, drew him away, and sat down on a pile of wreckage, holding Eirik before him. "So, you have lied, I see. It was a lie, every word you said of these friends of yours. Answer me now." But Eirik answered nothing. He stood staring up at the man's face, clean dazed. It seemed he could not make it out at all. The end of it was that Olaf had to take Eirik on his knee to stop his bitter weeping. He said again and again that Eirik must never say what was untrue, or he would get a beating. But he spoke much more gently now, and between whiles he stroked the boy's head. Eirik nestled close to his father's chest and put his arms tightly about his neck. But he did not understand. Olaf was sure of that, and it affected him almost uncannily. This boy that he held in his arms seemed to him so strange and odd. What in God's name had come over him that he could invent all these lies? To Olaf it was so utterly aimless that he began to wonder. Was Eirik altogether in his right mind? Ingunn stayed indoors for nearly 9 weeks after her lying in. She was not notably sick or weak. It was rather that she had grown too fond of her life in the narrow chamber, where everything was done for the comfort of herself and the infant, and all was shut out that might disturb her. She let herself sink deep into this new happiness. The infant she had at the breast, and Eirik who ran in and out of her room all day long. Toward the end Olaf began to grow impatient. They had passed so many bad years together, and in all that time she had clung to him. Now she was happy and well, and she had recovered some of her youthful beauty. She barred herself in with the children and kept him away. But Olaf allowed nothing of this to appear. At last, on the Sunday after St. Lawrence's Mass, she kept her churching. Eirik was asleep when the company left home in the early morning, but he was out in the yard when the church folk came back. A new custom had grown up, although many didn't like it. They said it was tempting God with overweening pride. Young wives at their first churching, especially if the child was a son, wore again on that day their golden circlet, the bridal crown of noble maids, outside their wedded woman's coif. Ingunn had fastened her white silken kerchief with the golden garland. She wore a red kirtle and her blue mantle with the great gold brooch on it. Olaf lifted his wife from her horse. Eirik stood rapt, gazing at his mother's loveliness. She seemed much taller in this splendid dress. With the silver belt around her slender waist, her movements were lithe and supple, light as a bird's. "Mother!" Eirik exclaimed, beaming. "You are Lehman, after all!" In an instant his father seized him by the shoulder. The blow of a clenched fist fell on his cheekbone, making his head swim. Blow followed blow, leaving the child no breath to cry out. Only a hoarse whistling came from his throat, till Una Arnesdatter came running up and caught the man by the arm. "Olaf! Olaf, curb yourself! He is a little boy. Are you out of your senses to strike so hard?" Olaf let go. Eirik let himself fall backward, flat on the ground. There he lay, panting and whining, black and blue in the face. It was no swoon. Half on purpose, the boy behaved as if he were dying. Una stooped down to him and lifted him to her lap. Then his tears began to flow. Olaf turned towards his wife. He was still trembling. Ingunn stood bending forward. Eyes, nostrils, the open mouth were like the holes in a death's head. Olaf laughed, a harsh, angry laugh. Then he took her by the upper arm and drew her into the hall, where the maids were now bringing in the banquet. None of the company had heard what the child said, but all thought the same. No matter what he had done, it had been an ugly sight to see the father correct the little boy so roughly. They sat about on the benches, waiting to be bidden to table, and all were ill at ease. At last Una Arnesdatter came in, carrying Eirik in her arms. She set him down beside his father's knee. "Eirik will not disobey you again, Olaf. You must tell your son you are no longer angry." "Has he told you why I chastised him?" asked Olaf without looking up. Una shook her head. "Poor little fellow, he has cried so hard he had no power to speak." "Never again shall you dare to say that word, Eirik," said Olaf hotly in an undertone. "Never again. Do you understand?" Eirik was still hiccuping spasmodically. He said nothing, but stared at his father, frightened and bewildered. "Never again are you to speak that word," his father repeated, laying a heavy hand on the boy's shoulder, till the child nodded. But then Eirik's eyes wandered longingly to the dinner table, which was groaning with good things, and so the company seated themselves. Eirik was to sleep in Thorhild's house that night, for there were so many guests at the manor. In the evening, when he was going across, his father came after him into the yard. Eirik stopped short, trembling violently. He looked up at the other in such mortal fear. "Who taught you to say that ugly word of your mother?" Eirik looked up, frightened. The tears began to rise. Olaf could get no answer to his question. "Never say it again. Do you hear? Never again." Olaf stroked the boy's head, saw with something like a sense of shame that one side of Eric's face was all red and swollen. The boy was on the point of falling asleep when he felt that someone was bending over him. His mother. Her face was burning hot and wet. "Eirik mine, who has told you this, that your mother was a layman?" The boy was wide awake in a moment. "But are you not layman?" "Yes," whispered his mother. Eirik threw his arms about her neck, nestled up to her and kissed her.